welcome to another episode of our dive into the Grimm's fairy tales. Today we will be discussing the tale of Hansel and Gretel. First written down by the Brothers Grimm in 1812, this tale has since been translated into over 160 languages across the globe. This tale has been reimagined many times over through the years, and one of the first was in 1963. An author by the name of Hans Traxler published The Truth About Hansel and Gretel, which said that although the two were siblings, they were adults, they weren't children, and were working as bakers in a little village in Germany. They murdered a rival ingenious confectioner by declaring her a witch in order to steal her recipes for gingerbread. The book also included the recipe itself, photographic evidence that this occurred, and was marketed as the truth behind the original folktale. It went global and publishers fought for the rights to it. However, Hans Traxler eventually revealed that he had written it for his own amusement as a prank, as 1963 was the 100th anniversary of Jacob Grimm's death, and that was a fact that the publishers didn't even think of. Some people also believe that Hansel and Gretel was a prediction of the horrors of history to come, as another author rewrote the story as a fiction novel which occurred during the Holocaust, with the children being sent to and hidden in the forest to save on persecution while the Nazis invaded the country. These are just a few examples of the retelling of this tale. There have been countless more, too many, way too many to go into, not even counting the movies, series, operas that exist around to have in it. Even with all the different versions of it, the actual folk tale itself is based on a true story and a real event, that being the Great Famine of the years 1315 to 1322. The Great Famine started with unusually heavy rains in spring of 1315 all across the European continent. Crop failures lasted until summer harvest 1317, and Europe did not fully recover until the year 1322. Not only did the crops fail, but livestock disease in cattle and sheep caused numbers to fall by as much as 80%. The price of food began to rise, and in some countries wheat prices rose by over 320%. Salt could not be obtained to cure the meat, and only the very wealthy could afford to keep emergency stores of food for the coming winters. This whole period was marked by extreme levels of disease, crime, mass death, and in some cases, cannibalism and infanticide. There are a number of documented incidents which show the struggle for survival at this time. In Bristol, England, the City Chronicles reported that in 1315, there was a great famine of death with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horse flesh and dog flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces such as were newly put into prison and devoured them half alive. Average life expectancy had dropped from around 36 years old to only 29 during this time. As the famine continued through 1316, the population was desperate. To provide some meagre relief and to fight for survival, people began slaughtering their livestock, eating seed grain which they couldn't plant, harvesting edible roots, grasses and bark in forests, and abandoning children to fend for themselves. Old people voluntarily starved themselves so that the children could eat, although voluntarily might be a bit of a stretch. They were probably put out to pasture, as a nice way of putting it. Some were so destroyed by hunger and driven to desperation that they even exhumed the dead bodies from cemeteries to consume the rotting flesh. That is documented, apparently. If people managed to survive the Great Famine, they had 20 years to level up to the Black Death. Wasn't living in the medieval age such fun? So cannibalism, crime and child abandonment is our introduction to the children's tale Hansel and Gretel. So if you haven't clicked off already in disgust, stick around. The tale begins with a family living in a cottage on the edge of a great forest, consisting of a father who was a woodcutter, his wife, and their 2 children. In the original versions, his wife was the blood mother of the 2 children. However, in later versions, and as more children read the books, the mother was changed to be a stepmother, as this was seen as something to be less maternal and could be easily interpreted into the villain of the piece, as they did in nearly all of them, to be honest, giving stepmothers quite a bad name. The family is poor, and during a time of famine, the father could no longer earn enough to put food on the table. Without voicing any other options, the wife and the mother of these children instantly goes for the option of taking them into the great forest and leaving them there. Just abandoning the children in there because they can't afford to feed them, and as the mother said, they can always have some more when times get better. That's a candidate for Mother of the Year award if ever I've seen one. Although the father didn't like the idea, he went along with it for the sake of keeping peace in the home. Hansel hears them as the children can't sleep for hunger, and slips outside, gathers up some white pebbles and fills his pocket with them. When they are taken into the forest at dawn the next day, Hansel drops these pebbles periodically, leaving a visible trail back to their home. The father builds them a fire in the forest, and the mother told them to have a nap while they gathered wood. You could ask why they went to sleep when they knew that they were going to be abandoned by their parents and left for dead, and I'll read this just so that you can make yourself aware. Hansel and Gretel sat down by the fire. At noontime they ate their crusts of bread. Since they could hear the sounds of an axe, they were sure that their father was nearby and had not left them. But it wasn't an axe that they heard. It was a branch that their father had fastened to a dead tree, and the wind was banging it back and forth. Following this, I don't think you can just blame the mother for having this idea, and the father went along with it like a dull pawn to it when he rigged up a branch hitting a tree in order to make axe sounds so that the children wouldn't follow them out of the forest when they left them there. They wake up in the pitch dark and use the moonlight to follow the white pebble trail back to their house. They arrive back at dawn and was immediately chastised by their mother for staying out in the woods all night. The father was happy that they were back, as he had been upset that they had abandoned them and was having second thoughts and regrets. Time passed and a larger famine hit the country. I think this is the one that is in reference to the Great Famine. And a repeat of the previous conversation happens. He tried to dissuade his wife, but she kept arguing and nagging at him. And since he had given in the first time, he felt that he also had to give in the second time. Hansel yet again overhears them in this conversation about child murder, and went to go to the door to find the pebbles again so that they would be able to come back. However, the door is now locked and they can't get out. So when the dawn comes and they are taken into the forest, they use the breadcrumbs from the crusts of bread that they are given to leave a trail for wherever they're going. Same as last time, they're taken deep into the forest, deeper than previously, so that there's no chance of them coming back out again. And again, a fire was built, and again they were told to have a nap, which they do, again, even knowing that they're in even deeper than before. But when they woke up in the dark, they tried to use the moonlight to follow the trail of breadcrumbs. However, it being a forest and filled with birds and animals of different natures, the breadcrumbs had all been eaten. The children wander the woods completely lost and were surviving on berries and mushrooms that they would find. 3 days pass in this way when they heard a bird singing and stop to listen. When the bird flies away, he leads them to a little house deep in the forest in a little clearing. When they got close, they realised that the house was made of bread, the roof of cake, and the windows of sugar. Now, if I'd been living in the forest and surviving on mushrooms and berries for 3 days, I'd probably hallucinate a house in the clearing as well. Although mine would probably be made of lasagna with garlic bread for roof tiles and Doritos for window panes. I digress. Once they see the house, they don't even bother to be cautious and immediately run up to it and start ripping pieces off of it and eating it. Even when a voice from inside calls out to them, they continue ripping pieces off, with Gretel knocking out an entire window pane to devour it. If I had built my dream house in the middle of a forest and some children ran up and started eating it, I'd be a little bit annoyed. Anyway, this is when the door opens and a woman as old as the hills steps out. The description of which wasn't used in the first versions of this story, but caught on in later versions. The woman takes pity on the children and takes them by the hand and leads them inside her cottage. She feeds them pancakes and sets up comfy beds with fluffy pillows and wonderful white sheets for them to sleep in. This is the description in the book of the old woman. The old woman had only pretended to be kind. She was really a wicked witch who waylaid little children and had built the house of bread just to get them inside. As soon as a child fell into her hands, she killed it, cooked it, and ate it. That meant a day of real feasting for her. Witches have red eyes and can't see very far, but like animals, they do have a keen sense of smell, and they can always tell when a human being is around. When Hansel and Gretel got near her, she laughed fiendishly and hissed, "They're mine. This time they won't get away." Now that seems to me to suggest that she's had children in there before who have, and she hasn't come to any harm because of it. When the morning comes round, she grabs Hansel and throws him in a shed, locking the door. She then wakes up his sister Gretel and shouts at her to cook her brother food in order to have him put on weight, as when he's nice and fat, she will eat him. Hansel got the finest food cooked for him, and Gretel only had to eat crab shells. Although where they would get crabs in the middle of a forest... I'm trying to put logic in a fairy tale. I need to stop. To check if Hansel is fat enough yet, she asks every morning for Hansel to stick his finger out of through the bars of the shed, and Hansel tricks her by sticking a bone through the bars instead. Now I'm assuming that he finds this bone of previous children that have been locked in the shed. That's a little thing that I like to imagine, just right there. And as the witch's red eyes can't see very well, she doesn't notice that it is a bone and not his actual finger that he sticks out. After a month, the witch loses patience because she's hungry and says to Gretel, "Go get some water and be quick about it. I don't care whether Hansel's lean or plump. Tomorrow I'm going to butcher him and then I'll cook him up for dinner." Isn't she wonderful? To make a great feast of this, the woman wants to do some baking, and the oven is heated up in preparation for this. She pushes Gretel over to the oven and tells her to crawl in to see if it is at the right temperature enough. This was her way, too, of getting rid of Gretel. Gretel used the old bait and switch, saying that she would go in the oven, but that she didn't know how to get in there. So the witch, being hangry and bad-tempered, loses her patience, sticks her head in the oven, and shows Gretel how she could get in there. Gretel pushes her in and bolts the iron door behind her. Why they waited a month to push her in the oven, I don't know. When the witch starts screaming in pain and agony, Gretel runs out to the shed to unlock the door where Hansel is being kept captive. As the witch was dead now, they felt no qualms about going back in the house and looting it for everything that it had in it, filling their pockets with pearls and jewels, but not food, apparently. Considering how much the lack of food participated in the whole events of this story, they didn't even bother to steal any, and not knowing how long or how to get home even, they didn't even take anything, any crust of bread or anything at all. They left the witch's house and wandered for hours through the forest until they came to a lake. With no bridge in sight, they called to a duck to help them cross it. Although with it being a lake and not a river, they could have probably just walked round it, but remember the children. They took turns riding across on the duck's back, who was perfectly happy in order to give them a ride across this lake. They continued in the direction that they were going through the forest until it started to look familiar, and not before long they could see their father's house in the distance, and they ran to it. They rush in and throw their arms around their father. Their mother had died. There's no explanation given, although I do like to imagine that the father, who didn't want to abandon the children in the first place, after a month or so, got tired of the wife and killed her. And as it was a famine, I like to think that he ate her as well. You know, keep the cannibalism in a bit. They empty their pockets on the kitchen table, and the jewels, pearls, and everything else that they've looted drops out, and with their worries over, they all live happily ever after. And that brings us to the end of our episode for today. Please leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it. Also, you can comment down below if there is any particular fairy tale that you would like me to see me cover. I'm more than happy to look into requests for you. Thank you and goodbye.